Welcome to the debate. We are diving into quite a crucial topic today concerning English language learners, the many factors contributing to their, well, often notably low confidence. Our source material lists quite a few struggles, but if we want to find scalable solutions, we really need to pinpoint the primary driver.
Absolutely. Understanding the root cause is paramount. But this requires us to sharply distinguish between the intrinsic properties of the language itself, what makes English, well, inherently difficult, and those external, often quite preventable, dynamics around teaching methodology and learner psychology.
Precisely. So the core question for us today is this. Is low learner confidence driven primarily by the inherent linguistic difficulty and complexity of English, or is it more about the methodological and psychological barriers that learners encounter when they try to learn and practice? I'll be arguing that the structural hurdles within English, its confusing grammar, its massive vocabulary, and particularly its inconsistency, are the fundamental obstacles that really undermine confidence.
And I believe you fundamentally misplaced the emphasis there. I'm going to contend that confidence issues are, well, overwhelmingly driven by preventable errors, things like poor teaching methods, inconsistent practice habits, and, maybe most significantly, that deep-seated psychological barrier, the fear of making mistakes. This is really a battle fought in the mind and the classroom, not just, in the dictionary.
Okay, well, my position is that the inherent features of the English language create these structural hurdles that fundamentally undermine confidence, almost regardless of how motivating the teaching is. We see proof in the specific linguistic features learners really grapple with. Take pronunciation. Our source material clearly notes that learners struggle with English sounds that just don't exist in their native language, like the TH sound or certain vowel differences. This phonetic complexity forces learners into immediate self-monitoring, hesitation. When a learner knows that every single utterance carries this risk of being misunderstood, well, that's not a failure of method, that's a direct linguistic difficulty causing cognitive overload, and it instantly crushes confidence.
That's an interesting point. But I think you might be confusing consequence with cause there. While, yes, phonology is challenging, the crippling lack of confidence, I believe, is primarily driven by that psychological barrier, the fear of mistakes. It's anxiety and perfectionism that stop learners from actually using English freely. They worry much more about being exactly right than about being successfully understood. And that level of self-censorship, well, that's a mindset issue rooted in anxiety, not just a difficult sound system.
But isn't that anxiety born directly from the sheer structural size and, frankly, messiness of the language? Confidence is certainly strangled by vocabulary limitations. Learners need to express complex, nuanced thoughts, but they're handicapped by a limited lexicon. And critically, as the material points out, this deficit is compounded because words memorized through rote learning, without deep context, just aren't retained well. When the sheer scale and inconsistency of the vocabulary are the issues, that's a linguistic scale problem. You really can't solve it purely with positive thinking or different methods alone.
Well, if we're talking about poor retention through rote learning, that brings us right back to ineffective learning methods, doesn't it? The source material explicitly points to grammar-heavy instruction that simply doesn't build fluency. When instruction focuses so heavily on explicit correctness, which, given the complexity you rightly mention, is almost impossible to achieve early on, it creates the exact perfectionist fear we're describing.
Perhaps. But even the very best methods, I think, hit a structural wall when we look at grammar confusion. English grammar rules, all the exceptions, the tenses, they are inherently complex. The ultimate evidence for me that complexity is the bottleneck is this disconnect we see. Learners might know the rules perfectly well. They can ace a grammar test, but they consistently fail to apply them fluently in real communication. The structural complexity itself imposes too high a cognitive load for fluid, real-time application.
See, I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning. The failure to apply rules, I'd argue, is a function of poor training, not inherent difficulty dominating everything.
I'd say it's a function of the inherent difficulty itself.
I have to disagree. It's a function of instructional priority. If you teach students to mentally run a grammar check before they dare to speak, of course the application gap will persist, causing hesitation. Modern learning, the kind that focuses on interactive communicative tasks, well, it minimizes that rule-checking delay. You can't just blame the complexity of, say, the past perfect tense when the teacher is drilling conjugation tables instead of having students use it contextually to tell a compelling story. This overfocus on passive skills like reading and writing instead of actual conversation prevents real-world application regardless of how irregular the verbs might be.
But that sharp division you mentioned between classroom theory and real-world application, I believe it actually confirms the linguistic argument when we look at listening comprehension. Difficulty understanding native speakers, the fast speech, the idiomatic language, the sheer variability of accents, that is a powerful linguistic obstacle that practicing simple classroom phrases just cannot solve. The material is very clear on this. Classroom English sounds drastically different from real-life English.
That listening difficulty is real, yes, I grant you that. But it is fundamentally exacerbated by the lack of communicative practice. If learners engaged more robustly, more consistently, in high-tempo conversational practice, they would habituate much better to real-world speed and variance. You simply cannot isolate listening comprehension as a purely linguistic problem when the learner's method has effectively starved them of genuine communicative exposure.
But the sheer rate of auditory information processing required just to decode rapid, slang-ridden speech, that feels like a linguistic barrier in itself. It's a level of immersion that, when it fails, causes a catastrophic collapse in confidence.
And often that failure isn't just linguistic, it's cultural, wouldn't you say? We seem to be ignoring cultural barriers here. Misunderstanding idioms, humor, context. Yes, these are features of language, but the failure to teach them contextually and functionally is a pedagogical failure, one often neglected in standard curricula. So the barrier becomes instructional, not solely intrinsic to the English sound system or speed. You're kind of blaming the language for the way it's often poorly presented.
I maintain that even with optimal instruction, the structural complexity remains the greatest source of hesitation. Let's just revisit grammar confusion quickly. When a fluent speaker uses, say, the third conditional, they're drawing upon this massive, complex network of rules, but subconsciously. For a learner, this remains a conscious, high-stakes calculation. The system's complexity is the reason the rules are known, but often cannot be executed under pressure. That hesitation, that's the immediate precursor to low confidence.
I disagree with the conclusion that cognitive load from complexity is the primary issue here. That cognitive load is, or at least can be, minimized by effective instruction. If instruction prioritized fluency over explicit accuracy, if the main metric for success was successful communication, not grammatical perfection, that application gap would close dramatically. The anxiety caused by needing perfect grammar is, I believe, a consequence of poor instructional design, not the inherent difficulty of the structure itself. We're effectively teaching people to fear the language by prioritizing rote correctness over communicative success.
You place a great deal of weight on internal motivation and instructional choices. But what about external constraints? Constraints that surely compound the difficulty.
Well, let's look at those constraints then. You might point to environmental factors, but I challenge the idea that a lack of resources is the key inhibitor. The source material highlights inconsistent practice, studying sporadically rather than committing to long-term habits, as a significant problem. And this suggests that a lack of motivation, or perhaps discipline, is often a greater inhibitor of progress than purely environmental factors. Even with perfect access to native speakers, if a learner only studies in these short, isolated bursts, their confidence is bound to stall. The internal decision to commit and maintain focus, I think, often outweighs perceived external limitations.
That's a compelling argument regarding discipline, yes. But have you considered that maybe limited access to resources is what causes or at least significantly contributes to the inconsistency? Limited access meaning the lack of readily available native speakers, authentic language partners, or even reliable technology-based tools. That's a concrete external barrier. For learners who are geographically isolated or perhaps lack financial means, this limited access compounds every other issue. They might be highly motivated, truly, but without consistent, high-quality input and authentic interactive output, achieving the kind of real-world fluency that builds confidence becomes, well, virtually impossible. The linguistic challenge needs practice to overcome, but the environment can place a hard ceiling on the quality and consistency of that practice.
But surely the necessary tools, apps, international news sources, online communities, they exist now more ubiquitously, more accessibly than ever before, right? If a learner is failing to use these widely available resources for consistent practice, doesn't that bring us back to the question of habit formation and self-efficacy? And that sounds like psychology and method to me, not primarily linguistics.
Perhaps. But accessing and utilizing those resources successfully often requires a base level of confidence and linguistic competence in the first place. A learner needs enough foundational skill to even engage productively in an online exchange. Otherwise, they risk the very confidence crash we're discussing. The linguistic challenge arguably must be addressed first, or at least concurrently, for them to even attempt the methodological improvements you champion.
And I'd argue that foundational skill is best built through methods that prioritize communication over calculation, methods that reduce that initial anxiety right from the start.
So we seem to circle back confirming the deep interrelationship of all these factors, but perhaps maintaining different hierarchies of importance when it comes to addressing this confidence deficit.
Indeed, it seems so.
Okay, so to summarize my position, I maintain that tackling the inherent deep-seated linguistic challenges must precede, or at the very least accompany, any broad psychological intervention to truly build resilience and confidence. The core structural problems, like the complex rule sets that inhibit clarity, the genuine struggle for accurate pronunciation, and that fundamental comprehension gap between idealized classroom English and rapid, messy, real-world native speech, these feel like the immovable objects. Until we find truly effective ways to dramatically simplify the assimilation of these inherent difficulties, I believe learners will continue to suffer confidence issues driven by performance anxiety, regardless of how much we try to minimize their fear of making mistakes.
And my final perspective really stresses the psychological factors and the critical need for a methodological shift. I believe the largest and most immediate gains in learner confidence will come from prioritizing the reduction of the fear of mistakes and fundamentally shifting away from methods that promote rote memory towards consistent communicative practice. English is complex, no doubt about it. But if learners are taught to value meaning-making over grammatical perfection, and if instructors really focus on building communicative habits, then the anxiety begins to fade. And then they gain the necessary resilience to navigate the linguistic challenges you've highlighted. Confidence, for me, is primarily a psychological outcome of successful, meaningful interaction.
Well, we've certainly demonstrated that the struggle facing English language learners is complex, and that both the inherent structure of the language and the methods used to teach it contribute significantly to this issue of low confidence.
Yes, and examining these factors through these somewhat opposing lenses, whether it's linguistic structure or learner mindset, definitely deepens our understanding of these critical challenges. And it reminds us, I think, that there is always more to explore in this material.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.